This is such a surprisingly, in a way, sweet and filled with subtlety reading, such a wonderful promise to them who will receive him, to as many as receive him. To them gave he the power to become the sons of God. And I say subtle because, of course, we don't really know what that word receive means. I was thinking that this reading is particularly apt for people from the West because so much of our consciousness is about doing everything on our own. It's trained into us that the better we are, the more accomplished we are, the more independent we can be. That's where we come from. That's what has us have a feeling of success or not. And yet this reading really very gently, in some ways, wants to coax us to imagine that there's something else, that maybe, in fact, we don't need to do it all on our own. And it really, it takes us to that place where I always want to give the last lines first, these two bottom lines of the spiritual path. One is that the whole purpose of life is to help us change from ego consciousness to soul consciousness. You've all heard me say this many times. And the other is that the way to do that is to meditate. So now we know where I'll wind up in about 25 minutes. You can't help it because otherwise it's hard to see the depth of the meaning of this reading other than to realize that unconsciously we live so much in a different reality than what this reading is speaking to. Because what is St. John talking about here? What is the Bible talking about when he talks about, to them gave he the power? First of all, who's the he? What's the power? And what does it really mean to become the sons of God? And how would we receive that power? So we have to start by first saying that the power that they're talking about, the power that's being alluded to in this reading, is really simply God's grace. And it's a power, and I say simply, that's not so simple, that's wonderful, but that is what's trying to be given to us if we could receive it, if we could put ourselves in a position to be open and available and desirous of having this divine grace enter our lives. We could sit here and we could say, well, of course we want that. But I was thinking this morning during purification, and I know there are some of you who don't come to purification all the time. Perhaps some of you have never been there. But it's the service that we do from 9 to 9:45. And after we chant some mantras with fire and with ghee and with rice. And those are very important, but I won't talk about them right now. But the way that everybody who comes to the service gets involved is that there are light bearers up here, and we are wanting to be open channels for that purifying presence of God. And then each of you comes up with a slip of paper. And the first thing that you say is, I seek purification by the grace of God. You're on your knees in front of a light bearer. And those are the words you say. And I've often wondered why everybody isn't here. I know people have very strong feelings about the purification ceremony. I happen to love it. It doesn't matter whether I'm the light bearer or I'm out there and I'm coming before the light bearer. But just this morning, because it struck me, Amara prayed this morning and she talked about the light bearers wanting to be ever increasingly pure channels for these masters. And it reminded me that that is the process by which we receive divine grace, that the purer channels we are, the less ego that's here, the more this grace can not really descend, we think about it descend, but really be alive within us, because of course it's already there. So that was the prayer. And then as each person came up and uttered those profound words, I seek purification by the grace of God, I thought it just takes such humility, such longing, such devotion, such absolute clarity of desire to want God in our lives, to receive that presence, to be able to come up here and say, yes, I seek purification by your grace. And then this next most beautiful line that is so touching, you can't utter it without being deeply touched. The Master says, open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. Really, another way of saying, open yourself up to experience that which is already in you, and then that presence will be able to guide you, to show you the way to everything we want in life, to inner peace, to inner contentment, to all those things. Now, I've said this before, other light bearers have said it before, because the purification ceremony is just that powerful. But it's so relevant today because it helps us see in that moment we can have an awakening. In the very moment that I think some people stay away from because it feels a little too, like we're giving something away. We're not used to being on our knees. We're not used to asking for grace. We anthropomorphize, so we think it's making us less than. I don't know why everybody doesn't come. As I said, I've never quite understood it. But in a moment, if we could receive the truth of those words, we would be free. And it's absolutely nothing. What St. John is talking about here, receiving God, has nothing to do with how much we know, with any intellectual understandings, with any of the initiations that we take here at Ananda, with any of the vows that we take or the promises that we make. It's not an intellectual or an emotional knowing. It's something that happens in a moment when we open to divine grace. Swami tells an interesting story in one of the places where he's talking about attunement, which is, of course, what he talks about in this reading. But he said it has nothing to do, this receiving the power to become a son of God, has nothing to do with our intellectual abilities, with our stature in the world. And he talks about a disciple of a great saint that he went to see in India. He went to see this saint because Yogananda had gone to see the saint. And in fact, in the autobiography of a yogi, this was a disciple of a great saint. Yogananda said, if I had spent another half hour in his company, I would never have been able to leave India and come back to the United States. And Swami said he went to see him, and he knew that Master's words must have meant that this is one of his greatest disciples. He said, and yet when I read the works of this great saint, in no place was this disciple's name mentioned. And Swamiji said, he said probably to many people who worked for this saint, who sat in the company of this saint, he was just another name on a mailing list. Those are Swami's words. And yet here he was, somebody who Yogananda said, if I had been in his company another half hour, I couldn't have left India. Boy, that really went so deep in me I mean, I think particularly as a teacher, a leader, somebody who's wanting to connect with anybody and everybody who wants to receive these teachings, I thought, remember that line, Shanti, just another name on a mailing list. We never know. It's not about anything that we have to work really hard to do. There's that beautiful saying of Yogananda's, self-realization is the knowing in body, mind, and soul, that the kingdom of God is within. And to realize that truth, all we need to do is increase our knowing. There's something so simple about that, so sweet in a way, and naive. There's nothing hard to learn here. There's no enormous amount of studying that needs to be done. This chant that was chanted this morning that was so dear, receive me on thy lap, O mother. And I just kept having the image of this little child crawling up into its mother's arms and just resting there. Cast me not at death's door. Cast me not at delusion's door. The chant is talking about, don't let me die by holding on to my ego. Don't throw me out there. Receive me on thy lap. It's so beautiful. But then Swami goes on to say, really, can we do this on our own? Are we capable of doing it on our own? Or do we need help? And in the reading, he makes that very clear. No, we have to have a guru. There's that very sweet story when he was in India and talking to a reporter. And she said, well, do you think everyone needs a guru? And Swamiji said, no, everybody doesn't need a guru. I wasn't there, but in the telling of the story, I've heard that he said, why would you want that? Why would you want somebody always telling you what to do? No, everybody doesn't need a guru. But if you want to know God, yes, you need a guru. There's a beautiful story that I heard years ago about one of the people who's lived up at Ananda for many, many years up at Ananda Village. It's Dr. Peter, and this story's been told all over, so obviously he shared this story. He had a very compelling dream about just this once, a obviously inspired dream. He was on the beach, and right where the sand and the water come together, he saw a huge mound, of black, thick, tarry, hard material. And in the dream, he knew instantly that that was his karma and that he had to work through it. But there he was on the beach, feeling like a little boy. He had a plastic bucket and a little tiny plastic shovel with him. And he looked at this mound, but he was compelled to work on it. So he went over and he started working with the shovel on this mound, and he worked, and finally he said, one little piece of this tarry material came off. And he just kept working at it, and finally he had his little bucket filled, and he took it down to empty it into the ocean. And as he did that, he became just filled with despair. He said, how am I going to do this? Here I have this huge job in front of me, and I have totally inadequate tools. And what am I going to do? He asked God. Just then, he hears a loud rumbling from behind this mass of tar. So he goes around the side, and he looks, and there's Yogananda with a huge smile on his face, sitting up on one of those big pieces of equipment with, those huge shovels. And he's just joyously, he has almost the whole mound removed, except a tiny little shell that Dr. Peter could see. Isn't that just an amazing dream? If we receive the guru, if we open to the guru, we have no idea what that guru can do for us. We know nothing. It's actually pretty remarkable. But what does it mean to have a guru, to develop that faith, to open in that way? What is our role in there so that the guru can allow himself to manifest fully within? The first thing is that it takes complete obedience. Why does it take complete obedience? I know that's a word that we all have trouble with, because we never really have any idea all of what the guru's working with, just like Peter didn't in his dream. We think we know what's going on in this world. Many of you have heard me tell the story, and I won't tell it, but about going to medical school without a college degree. It's impossible. It's the story in my life more than anything that has me remember we have no idea. I've had a lot of miracles in my life. I know many of you have because we read them in Asha's book. Every one of those miracles just say we have no idea what the guru is doing. There's a story that I read just yesterday that I had never heard about a saint. I think his name is Sananda. I'm not sure. I can't remember the saint or the disciple's name right now. But the saint was walking from one village to the next with a bunch of his disciples, and he had always told the disciples, don't eat meat. It's not good for you to eat meat. But this was a very long pilgrimage they were on. They sat down for a meal, and the teacher ate meat. But he had all of his disciples eat vegetables and rice. And as they got back out to walk, the saint had all this energy, and he was ahead of everybody. And one of the disciples started getting really angry, mumbling to himself, yeah, he tells us not to eat meat, but look at the energy. How are we supposed to keep up with him? Of course, the saint could hear all this, even though he wasn't saying it out loud. So when the next meal came, he went up to the disciple. He said, would you like to eat with me just what I eat? And the disciple said, yes. They had come upon this place in town where there was a fire, and half of the fire was being used by a welding smith. I forget what they're called right now. A blacksmith, thank you. And he was forging these nails. And on the other half of the fire was this gorgeous piece of beef that was being roasted over the fire. So the disciple gets his appetite all worked up, and the saint sits down. Everybody, of course, knows where the story's going. And he eats the red-hot nails. And he gets this big smile on his face. And at that point, the disciple bends down and touches his feet. We have no idea. We have to have total obedience because we cannot know what the guru knows and where they're working from. We have to have total trust in what the guru's telling us. And we have to feel deep, deep love, total and pure love. This is part of why when Master, in those last few days, even before he left his body, when I think it was Dayamata who asked him, after you're left, what could possibly take your place? He said, only love can take my place. And then he told the disciples later, I want you to treat each other with as much love and as much respect as you treat me. Meaning, without love, without pure love, that we would give to our guru and see the guru in each other, because God is in everything. There's nothing else that could take his place. Now, it really raises the question for many of us about how is it that we know who the guru is? How is it, or what do we need in that guru, and how do we know that the guru is fully realized? I'm telling you all of these stories today, but there they are. They're just coming. A wonderful story from the Mahabharata about King Bharata and his son Ramana, who they were actually both very great disciples, but the king at one point calls his high priest, and he says to the high priest, I want within 7 days for you to prove to me that God exists. And the high priest said, I can't do that. I've studied theology, but I'm not a master. And the king said, I've hired you to teach me about religion. You have 7 days. So the priest is really worrying about it. And Ramana, who's the king's son, who's not really supposed to be all that bright, goes to his father and said, I have a way to solve this problem. He said, I want you to go to the priest, and both you and the priest, you just do anything I ask of you. So Bharata says, okay. So Ramana takes them both, and he ties them each to a tree, separated from each other. And he says, and he just has them sitting there looking at each other. And he goes over to his father and he says, say these words to the priest. You have 7 days to come and set me free. And tell him that. Tell him very calmly. Tell him that he's been ordered by the high court. This is what he's been hired to do. And the father looks at his son because obviously the priest is tied up just like he is. But he says the words slowly. This is a decree from the high court. You have 7 days to get me free. And the priest says to him, how could I possibly set you free when I myself am stuck here in bondage? And at that point, the king realizes that there's no way that the high priest, who was trying to tell him that he was a theologian and not a master, could possibly free him from all of his delusion and all of his bondage. We need to find those people who have realized knowledge, because only that realized knowledge, not book learning, not anything else, can set people free. So we have to find those who speak from having had the experience, and then we give them our total trust, our total love, our total obedience, and ask that they come to us. This is what receiving God means. It means opening up with all that faith, willingness, devotion, and saying, this is beyond my mind. This is beyond me. You come and you allow me to feel your presence. In the Bhagavad Gita reading today, it's so beautiful. I don't have the words right here, but it says, that devotee who loves me, that devotee who opens their heart to me, who invites me in by their awareness, he said, I'll light the lamp that will disperse all darkness. Our job is to constantly be putting ourselves into a position to raise our consciousness, to be doing whatever it is we need to do, to be able to be where the Guru is, to allow him to enter and take charge of our lives. That's what our job is to keep looking for the way through, and we do this in many ways, of course. We do it through study, we do it through chanting. I remember one day I was having a meditation with Jyotish, and before the meditation started, he said, let's base this meditation on having an image of Master's eyes. Hold that at the point between your eyebrows. I think it was the day after Kriya, because it was an extraordinary meditation. But so many people, just by looking in Master's eyes, why is that? Because then we are opening ourselves up to seeing the qualities that are in him. That's one thing. Seeing what our goal is. To realizing in his presence, that's his purpose here, that we too have the potential to become that. When Jyotish said, just look at the master's eyes, and Swami said it, I read it yesterday again, sit with a picture of master in front of you, look deeply into his eyes before you go deep into meditation. And imagine those eyes with you, because all of that is like elevating ourselves to that place where God can come to us and we can receive him. The reading, just lost one thing. Let me just see if it'll come back to me. The reading is compelling because it says, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God, which for us means not the Son of Man, which is how most of us live. It says he will lift us into his infinite power, not the way we live with our finite power. And it says, I can then take them from ego consciousness to soul consciousness. This takes a little work. I just had this flash of I don't know why this came to me, although Jyotish in one of his blogs recently, A Touch of Light, he told a story about this, but I think this is the original comedic, this was the original comedic acting out of this. I don't know how many of you in here remember Amos and Andy, but it was a radio show and then became a television show from the late 20s into the 50s. Amos was the smart one. He was the one who knew things. Andy was always making mistakes. And Andy said to Amos one time, I'm always getting into trouble. I'm always making mistakes. And Amos said, yes. And he said, well, why is that? And Amos said, because you make bad decisions. And Andy said, well, how do I learn to make good decisions? And he said, by making bad decisions. So we're all on this path. We're all learning. We all will keep opening ourselves to the divine presence, hopefully to that realized knowledge that will take us to that place where we know we in fact are a son of God.